Morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this session. It's already very well attended, and I can understand why, because one of the big issues at the moment is the schools bill passing through Parliament, and the idea of this session today really is to focus on the schools element of it. We're well aware there's a wellbeing element of it as well, but we'd really like to hone down and look at the schools element of it. Firstly, what impact it's going to have on a system level, but also how that might feed down to a school level as well. So we're going to try and cover a lot of ground. There will be some opportunities to ask questions at the end. So first off, to introduce the panel, we have Leora Cruddas, founding CEO of Confederation of School Trusts. We have Manny Botway, President of ASCL. We have Sir John Coles, CEO of United Learning. And we have Andrew O'Neill, head teacher of the All Saints Catholic College. So to kick us off, there's been a lot written about the bill, and some of it's very complex, some of it's very technical, and some of it is ideological. And I've asked Leora if she could just start by outlining the key sort of points under contention. So Leora, over to you.
Thank you, John, and good morning, colleagues. So I think the first thing to say is, as John's indicated, we welcome part one of the bill, which is the children and wellbeing part of the bill. We have more reservations about part two of the bill, which deals with schools and in particular with academy freedoms. So I'll say a little bit about the different measures and what our concerns are, but perhaps I'd like to start by saying that our position is not an academy protectionist position. So we think that the freedoms and flexibilities that hitherto have been the preserve of academy trusts should now be extended to all employers. That feels like a principle. As we go forward with the reform journey and as we build an education system which moves from a really good education system in England, we should really be proud of that, to a great education system, but in a context which is quite challenging, not just the fiscal and economic context, but also a very challenging global context. Employers in the school sector are going to need those freedoms and flexibilities to respond in the best way possible to the communities they serve. So we're worried, we have been worried, that the restrictions placed on employers potentially is a step backwards and not a step forwards. But I'm happy to say that we've been working very constructively with government, and we have arrived at a position on some elements of the measures that we are happy with. So we're happy that we secured an amendment to teachers' pay. So the amendment will say that there is a floor and not a ceiling on teachers' pay, and that trusts should have regard to conditions. So that's a really important amendment. We're still worried about the proposed new power in the bill, which would give the Secretary of State power to direct academy proprietors on any operational aspect of the running of a trust as an independent legal entity. We think that compromises the legal independence of a trust, and also potentially the charitable organisation of a trust. So we are looking for a further amendment on that particular provision in the bill. On others, we have managed to secure good agreement with the department through secondary legislation, in other words, through regulation. So the example that I'll give you there is the QTS measure. So the QTS measure would say that all teachers in all types of school structures must be qualified, must have qualified teacher status. It is certainly true that the vast majority of teachers in all types of schools do have qualified teacher status. But there are some notable exemptions, and we do want to protect those exemptions, particularly because of the potential impact that this could have on our wonderful special schools and alternative provision schools, where it's actually quite important that we allow people who are qualified in different ways to be in our classrooms. So we're dealing with that through regulation and through exemptions guidance, rather than through seeking a change to the proposed primary legislation. So I've spoken quite a lot. There are lots of other measures that I could talk about, but perhaps I'll just stop there. That gives you a flavour of the work that we're doing with government and the way that we've approached what otherwise could have been, I think, quite problematic legislation for us.
Thank you, Leora. And Andrew, you've come out, you've written for TES as well about this, about you're quite supportive of the bill.
Yeah.
Do you want to pinpoint some elements of it that you find are really positive and that you think are a good move for the sector?
Yeah, I mean, my view on this is that it's relatively innocuous. And I think that the amount of noise that's being created around the bill in its entirety has been from a very, very small part of our sector, and largely from Academy Trust. And I kind of understand where some of those people are coming from. But I think it's difficult to strip away the politics from all of this, and the politics of the last decade, 15 years. You know, Labour brought academies into fruition. It was almost like an extension of the grant maintain system of the Tories in the 90s. But, you know, since 2014 under Nicky Morgan and that absolute march to make every single school in the country an academy, there's been a complete asymmetry in the system. And that has been such that everything has been, all of the power and the control and the money has been directed towards becoming academies and academies in and of themselves. And that's bad governance of a system. Because you then have a whole other part of the system which are maintained schools, which are currently half of the system, but like, you know, we go back to 2018, 2017, there were way more than half of the system that aren't being adequately governed, and the parts that do look after them, like local authorities, completely and utterly asset stripped. And I think what we're seeing here from the Secretary of State is actually just good governance. She's come in and she said, right, this is the system in its entirety. Half of the schools are academies, half of them are maintained schools, and we're going to look at some legislation that will redress this and bring some balance back to the system. And, you know, lots of the people I speak to on this issue in the maintained sector, and actually, fundamentally, most of my contacts are in the academy system, and they're like, we see no problem with this legislation. You know, I think Schools Week, I hate to mention Schools Week in front of you, John, but Schools Week commissioned that, they commissioned that survey through Ajurio, which pretty much largely said that people saw it as a innocuous policy and they didn't see any problem with it. And that's kind of my view. I do take some of the points that Leora's made, but I think the noise that's been created around this is just way over the top and speaks to the asymmetry of the system and the power in the system that doesn't reflect the masses.
Manny, like, in terms of how this debate's playing out among your members, and I mean here head teachers primarily, how much of this bill is on their radar, and how much of this bill do you find is causing genuine concern at that level?
Very good question. For those of you who don't know, I'm Manny Bottle. I'm not only president of our school, but my day job is I'm in my 10th year as a head teacher of a comprehensive school in Macclesfield, 11 to 18, fabulous. If I sound a bit tired, we've had Ofsted in, and it's also been the start of GCSE examinations. I don't think the Year 11s look sufficiently interested in the fact that my job rests on how well they do over the next 2 or 3 weeks, but that's not what you asked me. I think what I hear from members, particularly in the last month or so, when you get that email through with your gag, is there is a sense that if we rewind the clocks a year ago and we thought about the Labour government coming in July 2024, what I think a lot of people were hoping was an offer of hope. That's what we look for in our Secretaries of State, this sense of hope, this sense of a future, this sense that coming into education and coming into teaching, which I love, is the best possible profession. What a lot of our members are saying, and what a lot of my colleagues, I think on my head teacher WhatsApp, I have never in my time as a school leader seen so many WhatsApp coming through about how we make cuts in schools. And we're talking about cuts to bare bone services. So my issue I think there's a lot of good stuff in the bill, but I think a lot of leaders are saying, look, it doesn't address some of the fundamental issues that we are facing. You know, how many head teachers and school leaders are saying we are worried about staffing next year? We don't have enough teachers to cover the curriculum. My daughter goes to an absolutely fabulous secondary school. She has never been taught maths by somebody who is not in shorts. That is a PE teacher who's been redirected to teach maths. Now look, we're okay. 2 graduates at home. My wife's a chemistry graduate. She can sit down and provide support. But the people who this hits most are the poorest in society, who really, really need qualified, passionate teachers in front of them. You would have heard Pepe talk earlier about the challenge for parents with children who face special educational needs and the challenges that schools face. There's not a school leader here today who isn't being forced to make a decision about whether or not they can keep that mentor who's going to support that hard-to-reach family, or you know, that person who have in your mind eye that year 9 who needs some support with their literacy and numeracy. That's going to have to go. And there are, of course, other challenges, you know, relating to unfunded pay increases. The shock and the real fear from school leaders when they saw this announcement, I think it's really, really important that, yes, we debate the bill. And as I said, I think there's lots of good things in the bill, and there's lots of things that we should celebrate. But let's not get away from the fact that there are some very, very real issues that the government needs to get a grip of, and get a grip of very, very quickly. And the last thing I'll say is this is against the background of extraordinary cuts in our local authority. If you're a head teacher, or you're a DSL, or you're a Senko, and you pick up the phone and you're in desperate need of supporting a young person, you are not going to get a person at the end of the phone. There are local authorities that are struggling to pick up the bins, let alone fulfill some of those functions that are relating to vulnerable families and those with special educational needs. And the people that pick up the pieces are the people in this room. And the government has to get a grip with those particular issues. So that's what I'd say on that matter.
I think for those who don't know, John was in the DfE. John, can you give us an insight into, Manny's outlined a whole host of challenges there in the sector, and the bill doesn't address those challenges directly. What is your sense that we should view this bill as a manifesto on education or a plan for education? Is it something that's rushed out? How does this bill get to where it is with the flaws that you and Leora have identified and not address these problems? Can you give us some context around that?
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose this is ancient history now, isn't it? It shows you how old I am. But, you know, in 2001, at the end of the first Labour government and the election in 2001, which, you know, led to the second Blair term, you know, we produced a green paper, which I wrote at the time with Michael Barber, called Schools Building on Success, which set out in quite a lot of detail what is the plan for the next 4 years. And then post-election, we wrote a white paper called Schools Achieving Success, which turned some of those commitments into some more specific actions, changed some directions of policy, but fundamentally was in line with the green paper that came before. And then we introduced the 2001 Education Bill, which is now the 2002 Education Act, which I took through Parliament. And if you think about that as a strategy process, that is working out what are the broad things you want to do, what are the big issues facing the education system, how ought we to be changing this system to build on what's gone before, but also to make changes and improvements and tackle today's real issues, and then consulting on that, and then after an election, turning that into some concrete plans and policies, which have in them, at the heart, a set of big strategies. How are we going to spend our money? Where are we going to put our attention? What are the big problems that we need to tackle? And then the legislation is merely a few pieces of enabling action that are needed to change the law in order to enable you to do the things that you want to do. So in my worldview, the job of legislation is to enable the enactment of strategic policy. It's to allow you to do stuff, in short. And it starts with what are the problems we're trying to solve, what are the goals we've got, what are the actions we're going to take in the real world, and only then do you need to think about what are the powers we need to take. So my issue with the bill isn't, is this specific policy a good or bad thing? It's, I think, much closer to what Man is saying. What are the big picture issues that we're trying to solve, and why does that necessitate legislative change? And what is the theory of improvement that underpins that? And if I just carry on for a second, my view of the world is that public services in general and school system in particular improves when, firstly, the people who are leading schools and are responsible for them have a maximum amount of freedom to take decisions. They are the people who know the most, understand the most, and have the best understanding of the children they're teaching. And within a national framework, of course, because there are rules about how public money should be spent, leaders take decisions and are then, crucially, secondly, accountable for the decisions that they take. So the system that I think you want to try and build has high trust, high autonomy, high accountability built into it. That's the goal. That's the thing that improves education systems. And I agree that that should then be even across different types of schools. So it should be the case that if one school has a freedom to make decision X, another school has the freedom to make decision X. So in my mind, this isn't a question of is it academies or is it maintained schools. There should be a level playing field in which schools can act responsibly in the interests of their children, and they should then be accountable for it. But my view of the direction of strategic policy which works, and I say my view, but I don't think this is mere opinion. I think this is based on decades of, what proven practice about what has worked and what hasn't, is that it's decentralization, giving more autonomy to local leaders and holding them to account for the results. That is the thing that improves schools. It's not just the thing that improves schools, it's the thing that improves public services in general. And then, of course, you have to resource it. So my concern really fundamentally about the bill is not, do I like this policy or that policy? It's that directionally, it seems like it's centralizing rather than decentralizing. It's taking to government rather than giving to heads. And I think you improve a system by giving more autonomy, trust, and accountability to local leaders. That's what I want to see government doing. Because we do have these big national challenges. If you're poor and you're white in this country, your progress at secondary school is about a grade less, progress 8, than anyone else. And nobody's talking about that. And yet, in parts of our country, the fact that some people feel left behind is leading to all sorts of negative consequences. The rise of political populism, riots on the streets in some cases. And we're not talking about that as an educational issue, which is real and is affecting a lot of people. We're not talking about the fact that there's a north-south divide in education, that there are places where children make very good progress, and there are places where children... These are the substantive issues that I desperately want to see government wrestling with, because they're the issues facing children in our country now. So, take all of Manny's points. We can't get enough teachers, we haven't got enough money, and add to that these big challenges of inequity in our country. These are the challenges that I want to see government focusing on and wrestling with.
And Andrew, if we look at that, do you think the expectation should be that government tackled those things first, and that they shouldn't have come out with anything until they'd sorted out those big problems? How do you see, in the way that John's laid out, where does this bill fit into that trajectory?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I'd say to that is, John, you know that government are talking about that issue behind the scenes. So I don't think that's quite right. They are looking at these things, but you don't get into government and go, day dot, let white working class children, everybody, progress is minus 0.9, which is precisely what it is for exactly 88,000 children. So that is an issue being looked at. But the system has been made into a complete dog's dinner over the last 15 years. And I don't think we can deny that. COVID exacerbated some of those issues, those structural issues around how we fund schools. And I think where you're right is, we do need to level out some of that playing field, because it doesn't make sense that academies are funded September through August and maintained schools are done on a fiscal year. So I think we need to get some of those structures so that we can build on top of it and then hopefully have a white paper that brings about the structures that addresses those systemic issues around white working class, the northeast, the northwest in particular. You know, the difference, the average progress 8 score for schools in the northeast is minus 0.25. The average progress 8 in London is positive 0.25. So absolutely right about the difference in regions, but the northeast has largely had academy freedoms because there's a huge amount of academy trusts in the northeast of England, and they've had that autonomy. So it's not just about the structural autonomy, it is about system leadership and school leadership and what happens in schools to improve outcomes for children. But it's not also, and John, this is where I'm sure you could speak more to this, the cross-governmental partnership between like education, DCMS, health, on actually addressing some of these regional disparities and why many of our children are falling away from education and their parents aren't being supportive in terms of, you know, getting children into school. So it's bigger than just some of the stuff that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
And Laura, how do you see the sort of cohesion of what government is doing at the moment in this, speaking to both those points of they have a plan or don't have a plan, but is what we're seeing as an education sector enough from them on the key issues? Is this bill a distraction from other elements they may be doing, be it the curriculum review, the SEN review, or should it be seen as fundamental to their direction of travel?
So I think I want to pick up on what Manny and John have said, because I think that is substantively right. The challenges that we are facing in the school system and in the wider education system are not addressed in this bill. They're definitely not addressed in Part 2 of the bill. And I think the point that John made about the bill being directionally wrong is right. So this should not have become a conversation about maintained schools versus academies. It should not have become that. And that is why we were so keen to say that the freedoms and flexibilities hitherto exclusive to academies should be now made available to all employers and all leaders. So you could have laid a piece of legislation that did that. Instead of restricting freedoms for academies, you could have created legislation that was more enabling for all types of schools in all structures. And I think, just to reference another paper from that time that you're referring to, John, that was written by Michael Barber about education systems and different journeys of education systems. Michael Barber tracked, so how do you get a poor education system to a good education system? How do you get a good education system to be a great education system? And what is profoundly important, I think, in that piece of work that he did is the levers that you would pull for a poor education system are more compliance driven. They're more top down. But once you have a good education system, which the English system is, then the journey to become a great education system looks fundamentally different. And it does the things that John said. You need a sort of sense of direction, a sense of purpose about where the education system is going, but you also need to devolve much more to local leaders, much more freedoms and flexibilities, much greater autonomy at local level, and sort of resist the urge of governments to exercise central control. And that is a fundamental problem with the bill. And if I may just speak just briefly on the problem of poverty. So, a third of all children in England are poor. That is, 10 children in every class approximately, although there are regional disparities in that. 1 million of our children live in destitution. That means that there's not just food insecurity, but shelter insecurity. So they're probably coming into our classrooms cold, tired, hungry, and not know where they're sleeping tonight. We are still just about the world's 6th largest economy. That feels completely unacceptable to me, that we have that position for our children, and that poverty is getting worse. It's going in the wrong direction. So I'm pleased that we've got a Secretary of State who is committed to reducing child poverty, but I want to see the actions that this government is going to take to mitigate child poverty while we also build the resilience of our school system.
Manny, like, you've spoken about the concerns your members have, and if we look at what's solid that's come out of government so far, like what concrete we can see, it's Ofsted, we've got the framework, we've got the RISE system, although the consultation's still ongoing on some of that, and we've got this bill. Is that enough? When do you expect stuff to be delivered? When do your members want a delivery on the big issues, which are trickier? Would it have been better to wait and have nothing, or do you think it would be better to have these interim points? And if it is better to have the interim points, are these the right ones they've chosen, is I guess my question.
Good question. Well, you'll know that ASCO has a position on Ofsted, which I'm not going to go into much detail on, because that's not the purpose of today's meeting. As I said right from the word go, we represent 25,000 members, and the feedback that is coming back from our members, they are not talking about specific details of the bill. They are talking about struggling to balance the budget. We've all on the panel, everybody has talked about the real challenges that face youngsters who arrive at school who are from backgrounds, poverty-stricken backgrounds. Well, this is one of the months where you see this in action. There is nothing that is more sad or more desperate for a school leader than when you are lining students up to enter their English language examinations or their mathematics examinations, and you know that there are a significant proportion of young people sitting those exams who will not have a clue how to prepare, how to answer those questions. And you know that when it gets to the penultimate Thursday in August, if they arrive in the main hall to collect their envelope, you know what they're going to open. So there is a real challenge around assessment and what we do there, and how we ensure that what ASCO has referred to as a forgotten third, those youngsters come out of secondary education with not only a next step, but also some dignity. But also, when you just talk about the practicalities of the system, if you're a school leader, how many spare rooms do you have in the school right now that's not taken up with an exam, an exam access arrangement? And again, that is as a result of an assessment system that is no longer fit for purpose. If we are talking about nearly a quarter of young people having to have a significant adaptation to the way in which they sit their exam, then there's an issue there. So, look, they are some of the issues that are coming up. Funding, I think, is absolutely fundamental. What I do have to say is that there have been some really positive things that I would have to give the Secretary of State credit for. I do get a sense that this is a Secretary of State who understands the importance of teaching, and it does make a difference when you have a Secretary of State who talks up the profession, but that has to be matched with cold, hard funding. And some of the disparities that have been talked about on the stage also come down to that. My local authority is in the lowest 10 funded local authorities in the whole country per student. Now, I don't want to see anybody have any funding removed, but the schools and the school leaders in our local authority are saying, look, we need more. Our buildings are crumbling. It is not that long ago since we had the RAC disaster, which opened so much about how our school estates look and the fit for purpose nature of those. So I think in terms of some of those key issues, we need to hear more from government, and we need to have a white paper that articulates what is the vision for the next few years. Where do we want this to be? What is the entitlement for every single young person in the country?
And John, we know off the record, on the record, that the bill was rushed. We know that, as Manny's pointed out, funding is a big part of this. How do we situate the DfE and the wider government vision of education here? Is Bridget Phillipson and her team a pawn in a bigger political game, and we absolve them from blame? Do they have some autonomy over this, and some autonomy over schedules, where we can actually say, they've just got this timing wrong and this cadence wrong of policy?
I mean, honestly, it's hard to know. I mean, Andrew obviously knows much more about what's being discussed in the DFE than I do.
I doubt that, John.
I mean, I certainly didn't know any of what you just said was being discussed. So I honestly don't know. The thing that I do know, and where I would disagree with Andrew, is that the most effective governments in education of the last 30 years have come in with a really well worked out programme of policy. And whether you agree with it or disagree with it, in 1997, the Blair government came in and wrote a white paper within a couple of months. You know, it was their well worked through, properly analysed understanding of what they want to do. Same happened in 2001, same happened in 2005. Same happened, whether you like it or not, with Michael Gove in 2010. You know, there was a well worked through programme of policy. Honestly, I've been disappointed that that hasn't been the case with this government. I thought it would be. So I don't understand why that's the case. I do think there's an issue of DFE capability, which is not political, which is about the civil service. The civil service the Department for Education in my time was full of people who spent their entire life working on thinking about education, had built a career around that, and had real depth of expertise. Now, I think this is something the civil service has done to itself, really, over the years, and not under this government, under the previous one, that, you know, what's been valued in the civil service has been moving around between departments. And civil service always moved job too quickly. It was always an issue, but generally within a department. Now between departments, different. And so you've got a lot of very senior people in the department who are just as bright, just as capable, just as well motivated as anybody ever has been in the department, which don't know very much about education. And it's a real problem, I think, whoever's the Secretary of State. And I think you can say this capability was eroded quite seriously under the last government. Yeah. That, you know, the civil service's ability to identify serious problems, work out what the policy solutions are, propose them and be proactive has disappeared in large part. And there are things being put forward. I mean, we haven't talked, because it's not this bill, it's the other one, about the school support staff negotiating body. Now, like Leora, top of my list of worries about this bill was what was proposed about teachers' pay, because if that had gone forward in the way that was proposed, the impact on our staff would have been that we'd have been cutting teachers' pay, which I know is not the intention of anybody, and I know it is what the legislation would have done. So the legislation for that has changed. Excellent. I think, you know, people have listened, responded, great. But actually, in the employment rights bill in another part of the forest, exactly the same problem exists for school support staff at the moment. And actually, I won't bore everyone with how school support staff pay works at the moment, but the short version of it is there's something called the NJC, which decides a national pay spine, but then the detail of grading and where different support staff sit on that national pay spine differs local authority by local authority. So there are more than 150 different grading variants that exist in the country for support staff. It's extremely hard to produce. Leave aside academies. This is for maintained schools just as much as academies. That's really difficult to produce a national pay policy for support staff, because you will either cost the school system a huge amount of money, because what happened with the NHS under Agenda for Change, yes, we did have harmonisation of pay, but only because there were huge growth in NHS funding at the time, meaning that you could fund all of that to level upwards. We haven't got the money to do that in education. If we try and create a national pay structure, it's either going to cost the school system a huge amount of money, or you'll be cutting people's pay. Neither of these is desirable. So somebody in the DFE, not ministers, it's not politicians' job to know this stuff, it's a civil servant's job to know this stuff. I speak as a former civil servant. I'm irritated that these basic things are not being got right. And so I do think the civil service has some big things here to answer for, which is not about the politicians or their intentions. It's about, can these things be executed well?
Same question to you then, Andrew. Where do you put the ministerial team in the grander narrative around education? I mean, John's referred again then to the funding problem here, which they're not in control of, right? So how are you situating that team in the fact that we're having this debate now, in effect?
Yeah, I think I'm probably a little bit more positive than the rest of the panelists on this. I think I take your point about some of the history. I differ to a degree on it. I think the inheritance, and this is back to my initial point about we can't strip away the politics. The inheritance is unbelievable. So Secretary of State has come in and said, I want to rebuild trust with the profession. And it's very easy to go, rose-tinted glasses, 1997 was great, but it actually, for the first couple of years on the ground teaching, it wasn't great. And, you know, most teachers who were teaching back then would say that. 2010, you know, Michael Gove became Secretary of State. That was in May, the election. The white paper came out around November, December time, and then implementation of, you know, a lot of that took a couple of years. We're not even a year in. The Secretary of State hasn't even had a year, but the level of moaning we've had and the sort of hand grenades lobbed in and this is a problem and that's a problem, you know, I find it quite astonishing, and maybe it's that we live in the age of social media. But like, look at the funding, and you know, we look at the Treasury. The settlement that the Secretary of State has secured from Treasury compared to any other public sector is way higher. Now, we don't see that because we exist in our own bubble, but it's better than other public sector services. So I think we've got to see that actually the Secretary of State is fighting the corner for the profession. We look at, you know, you published this morning, John, around pay. We go back to the previous decade and we look at how our teaching workforce was disrespected, I think, to a degree by the previous government. You know, we went year after year after year of 1% pay increases, 1%, several percentage points below CPI. You know, the Secretary of State comes in last summer, and it's above CPI. We look at what's been, the rumour is around 4%. That's above it. And Manny, I get your point about funding, but I've balanced my budget. You know, I'm a maintaining school. I'm going to governors next Tuesday. It's been difficult, but that's on me. That's my job to do it. It's not my job to constantly say, oh, it's government's fault. Because as you say, John, we have to have a system of autonomy, and we do. I've got autonomy. The autonomy to be in control, set my budget. So I think, look, we have to look at the context and the inheritance the Secretary of State's got, look at the direction she's trying to get us all into against that really difficult financial backdrop. And it's going to take a bit more time than it did for Michael Gove, than it did for David Blunkett, would be my view.
And Leo, I want to ask you a bit about the knowledge base that the department came into, because one of the big things that we've talked about constantly in the pages of the magazine is do they understand that most of the capacity is in trust, because that's the way the system's been set up? Whether that's true or whether you believe in the MAT system or not, the capacity for improvement and the capacity for change has largely been centred through policy on the trust sector. It seems that a lot of the steps they've made, maybe they didn't quite realise what state the sector was in, and to that point, around the civil service, in opposition, you don't actually have access to that much resource, do you, in terms of getting a clear picture of where the sector's at?
So I think that's a fair analysis. Certainly in opposition, the resource that you've got is very limited. And you know, there hasn't been a Labour government for a long time, so they came in and did need to get to know the sector. You know, I'm pleased that more recently, the Secretary of State, for example, in her Centre for Social Justice speech, absolutely acknowledged the place of the trust sector and the capacity, the improvement capacity that sits in the trust sector. Now, before anybody thinks that this is a sort of anti-local authority position, it really isn't. I've spent a lot of my professional life working in local government, and I was working in local government when the financial crash happened. So I understand, in quite a visceral way actually, what those public funding settlements meant for local government and continue to mean for local government. So local government has had a huge amount of funding and capacity taken out of it. So my worry is that we are now in a system where many local authorities, not all, but many local authorities, you know, are finding it difficult to maintain their schools, to provide that level of improvement support for their schools, and that's not really the fault of local government. That is the financial reality of local government. So the corollary of that is true. The trust system has, for the last 15 years, been building its improvement capacity. And in terms of a theory of change, I would argue this, that it's the power of the group of schools working together in a single legal entity in deep and purposeful collaboration that has enabled us to build that capacity. And that is why I believe in the group of schools. I think it is a sustainable unit for our education system going forward, and therefore I do think all schools should now be in a group, in a single legal entity, if we are to face the challenges and the perturbations that I think we now face going into the future. And as I said earlier, I don't think that those are just national challenges. I think that they're also global challenges. So just for the avoidance of doubt, I don't like the term academization. I think that's a bit of a red herring, but the power of a group of schools working together in deep and purposeful collaboration. What's the problem with this, and what is stopping us embracing this as a way of building the sustainability of our school system so that we can best serve our children, young people, and our communities?
Thank you. And John, we spoke recently about when you're making policy, it's a mix of the possible and the political, and they come together and you find out what you can actually do. We're talking about some huge issues here around poverty, around systemic issues. Is it possible for a department to come out with something that fits between the possible and the political, that's going to satiate the sector's desire for change? Like, you looked after the London Challenge, right? That was about incremental change over time, and people gave you the time to make that change. Are we in the political space, I guess, where Bridget Phillipson and her team can meet the expectations of the sector? Are they reasonable expectations on those big issues?
No, it's a good question. I mean, so look, I mean, over the last 15 years, people in education might think they've been badly off, but we have been one of two protected sectors in every spending review. Education and health, well, specifically schools and health, have been protected in spending reviews for the last 15 years. So we're seeing a world of public service in which, however big we think the issues are in education, they're bigger in local government, they're bigger in justice, they are bigger in any in any public service that you choose to name, because funding has been reduced very sharply in real terms across those sectors. But it's true that teachers' pay is down in real terms in quite a significant way over that period, and that is obviously one of the major causes of the recruitment and retention problems. But it's nothing as compared to what's happened in some other public services. So the government as a whole has this immensely difficult problem and an immensely difficult inheritance, which is crumbling public services, an enormously difficult international scene in which, whether we like it or not, there is going to have to be a significant increase in defence spending in the next period, and an economy which is stuttering at best, although, better news this morning. So the question of how do we get out of the situation we're in as a society is a difficult and complex one. And I think trying to understand what the currents are which are leading to, the enormous growth in special educational needs, the enormous growth in economically inactive adults, the enormous growth in social problems, mental health issues amongst children and young people, I think these are all problems that we don't understand very deeply as a society. They're all problems that we're experiencing as a country in a different way to the rest of the Western world. And so all of this is very, very difficult territory. And so in answer to your question, John, can you solve... I mean, if the expectation of the education system is that somehow government's going to come in and wave a magic wand and solve all of these problems, then it's the education system that needs to reset its expectations. Because these are deep and long-lasting and established social problems which have become exacerbated over over time. And so no, I don't think a government can come in and solve all of those problems, because they are a complex set of interconnected problems in which we will not have a huge amount of money to throw at these problems in education or related services, where a whole range of wider social problems and a collapse in related social and public services creates serious problems for schools, which schools can't solve on their own. So all of this I take as a given. The thing that government can do and should do is articulate a clear view of what are our priorities and what is our strategy for achieving them, and in doing that, to give a sense of clarity of direction and purpose. That's what government can do, and it should be very honest about what can be solved and what can't be solved in the short run, what can be solved and what can't be solved in the medium term, and what are the longer term issues that of course we acknowledge but can't be solved immediately. Now that's I suppose what I'm saying is important and matters a lot. And so it isn't that I sort of unrealistically believe that somehow there could be a government at the moment which makes everything good for us again overnight. These are all difficult and complicated problems. But I think government can set a very clear direction, and that's what I want to see, really.
And Manny, to come to you last before we take some questions, so if you do have some questions, start thinking of them. Obviously, the government is under great pressure from the unions to act, and act fast, and act on specific issues. Do you think the union movement is going to give the government the space to articulate the sort of plan that John's describing?
I think one of the really important things that Sir John has articulated very, very well has been the collapse in some areas of the public realm, the disintegration in many areas of public services, which has then meant that schools in many areas of the land are acting like the fourth emergency service. So whilst I appreciate that funding has been protected in certain areas for particular public services, the expectation on schools has grown in that time. If there is public disorder in my local community, I am likely to receive a phone call from the local police to sort out that situation during the week. If there is a public order issue with a young person who's sadly suffering from mental health issues, schools will often be the first port of call. Now, I think one of the things that school leaders will irk school leaders over this is that we get into the profession because we're community-minded and we want to lead the community, but there has to be appropriate funding that comes with that. And if there isn't appropriate funding with that, then you can appreciate that there'll be school leaders who are very sore if they are held accountable for those things. Yeah. So, when I talk to school leaders up and down the land, they are talking increasingly about things that are not related to examination performance, for example, that they are involved in day to day.
Okay, so let's throw it out to the floor for some questions. What I ask is please keep the questions short so we can get through a few, and please direct it, if it is to a particular panel member, just make that clear. So if you want to put your hand up if you've got a question, it's down here.
Thank you very much for some great talks and comments. I have two very short questions. My understanding is that the Schools and Wellbeing Bill at the moment is requiring all schools, including academies, to follow the national curriculum exactly, whereas at the moment academy trusts have some freedoms regarding the curriculum. Do you see any possibility of a change in that back to where we were? And the second question is, do you see this as the death of the requirement that single academy trusts should go towards multi-academy trusts that we had under the Conservative government?
Leora, seems sensible to come to you on the curriculum question.
Yes, so thank you for that question. So that is true. There's a measure in the bill that would bind academy trusts into the national curriculum following the curriculum and assessment review reporting. So there's a few steps before we get there, but should that legislation be enacted, we would be in a position where academy trusts are required to follow the national curriculum. I think the first thing I would say is I have a huge amount of confidence in Professor Becky Francis, who is chairing the expert group for the National Curriculum and Assessment Review, and her interim report was very encouraging. Her analysis of curriculum and assessment infrastructure in the interim report was very encouraging. So I think it is true to say as well that the vast majority of schools in academy trusts do in fact follow the national curriculum, particularly at Key Stage 4, where there are examinations and qualifications and awarding organisations set out a syllabus. But at the margins of that, there are some issues for us to address as a nation. I do think, perhaps somewhat controversially, I do think it's the right of a government to set out a high-level national curriculum framework. So I think, in principle, that's not a bad thing. But I don't think it is the role of government to, in very minute detail, prescribe that content of the national curriculum. So there's a difference between a high-level national curriculum framework, which applies at state level, and then the way that curriculum is enacted. It is made alive and interpreted and lived in classrooms. And I think as long as we preserve that, then I think we'll be fine. And I have no reason to believe that we're not going to preserve that. So I'm sort of slightly less exercised, perhaps, than some of the heat and light around this, about the measure in the bill to require academies to teach the national curriculum. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very good. And Andrew, you wrote about this for us actually as well, about a long time ago. But do you see, to Leora's point, do you see the national curriculum in its current state and perhaps in its future state, from what Becky Francis has said, that it will be more conceptual than prescriptive?
Yeah, I'm with Leora on this. And, I'm someone who's, as a head, and Manny, you'll be the same, we look at the national curriculum an awful lot, and we're looking at it in the context of what our departments are doing and how that's enacted out. And I think sometimes people on the outside of teaching and outside of being teachers seem to, and the commentariat seem to sometimes think that the national curriculum is a set of schemes of work and lesson plans, that it's here you go. And that's not what it is. And that misconception wasn't really, I think, dealt with in some of the commentary around this issue. There are issues in the national curriculum and the way it's being exacted out, I think, in some academies, I would say, and that's been picked up by Becky in the interim review. She pointed out there's a line in it that was really uncomfortable, and particularly on my work on the expert advisory group around inclusion and SEND, that some schools are starting to teach GCSE in Year 7, GCSE content in Year 7. And we're robbing children of an education if that's what we're doing. And they're doing it because it's all pointing to attainment 8 and progress 8. And if that's our proxy for what a great education looks like, then actually we've got to hold on to the national curriculum and that framework and say that these are the lines that we need for our schools and for the integrity of our children.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yep, one at the back there next to you, Alex.
Thank you. Emily Vero, CEO at Three Spires. It's been fascinating conversation, so thank you all. Just a very simple, potentially crude question. What do you think is the single reason that is preventing people from coming into the profession? Why have we got such a recruitment crisis? What is it? Their own educational experience? Is it pay? Is it the curriculum? What do you feel is exacerbating what is already a really challenging position?
Well, John, you've got over 100 schools. What's stopping you recruiting?
Well, nothing's stopping us specifically
recruiting.
John,
sorry, you're fine.
We'll be training 450 new teachers next year. But look, it's a labour market. And what happens in labour markets is pay determines whether the market clears or not. So obviously there are all sorts of other factors which affect people's propensity to choose one job rather than another. And, you know, people can talk about workload and well-being and their own educational experience and etc. All of that obviously, you know, affects the individual decision that any individual subjectively makes. But the thing that affects the market as a whole is pay, really. And if you look at all the DFE data on their incentives and activities, there's compelling data on the impact of bursaries and other financial incentives, which can tell you more or less exactly how much recruitment is affected by changes to bursaries and incentives, and no evidence whatsoever about anything else. So I think it is a crude answer to, you know, a blunt question, but pay is the answer. You want more people to come into any job, pay more, and then they will.
Well, that's what Secretary of State's doing. That's the proposals last year, this year. She's trying to do it.
Good. You're interested in the politics. I'm interested in the children. Well, my questions. I'm not.
Sorry, John. I'm a head teacher of a school. I work with children.
Listen.
So
I'm sorry. That came out in a way that I didn't mean.
Well, pretty pompously, to be honest.
The point I'm trying to make is my point isn't about politics. I'm not pro or anti the government. I'm not making political points. All I'm trying to do is make a point about what is the answer to the question. The answer to the question is pay. That's it.
Manny, would you agree with that? Would you agree that pay was the main driver? Do you think
spiced up a little bit, hasn't it? So I'll get the popcorn out.
We'll have a cuddle after.
You know, I'm going to give one of those sort of slightly boring answers and say, look, I don't think you can put it solely down to one thing. I think pay is significant, but I think flexibility, we've got to be realistic that people who are coming out of university, they are going to be thinking about the labour market in very different ways to what they thought about it 20, 30 years ago, and they're going to want to live in a world where there's a bit more flexibility. That said, what I would say is that we have to take up the challenge of talking up what a great profession this is, because there are some things that we can offer in teaching that I think are increasingly more difficult to offer in other areas of work. We could give you a career, we could give you a profession, we could give you meaning. I know bottom set year 8 on a Friday is tough, but they'll thank you for it at the end of their time at the school. We've got year 11 proms. You know, there's fantastic things that happen in schools. And so I think it's really, really important that we talk up the profession and be open to some of the things that are happening elsewhere. And also just be aware that these are not unique issues to education. They're issues that face all front-facing public services. But all of those things that I said that I think that we can offer are things that we should promote. But pay's going to have to be a big one. You're going to have to
John,
pay.
can I just come in on that?
Yeah.
We've spent an hour moaning about the profession. You know, we've spent an hour moaning about government. You know, and I think the problem is often with us in these arenas and in the commentariat, like we don't advocate for the profession well enough. We talk about the problems constantly and incessantly, rather than the rich joys of actually leading and running schools like we do.
I get and understand your point, Andrew, but what I would say is that actually I think school leaders spend a hell of a lot of time persuading staff who are often paid, you know, if I think about support staff, and we'll all have them in our school, who are paid less than they would be if they're stacking shelves at Aldi. And the reason why they work at the school is because we are able to create a culture and environment that quite frankly gets people to work for far less than their market value. So I do think that we talk up the profession on a day-to-day basis. We've got to do it at all levels. You know, everybody's got to talk about it. And one of the things that I welcome for Bridget, to be fair, is that I have detected that change in tone, which is very much appreciated. But you'll forgive me, I think I'm entitled, I think we're entitled to say that, look, funding, resources are going to play a big, big part in this. Yeah.
We've got 30 seconds. I think Alex will let me have one more question if we ask nicely.
Yeah, my question's to Andrew, and I'm not trying to be offensive, but I think in some ways you're living in cloud cuckoo land when you're talking about the government putting so much money into education when it's unfunded. As we're trying to run a small primary school and having to make TA cuts in order to meet that 4% pay increase, now, I think you're completely off the page when we are having to make cuts, and those cuts are having a direct impact on children's well-being and their chances. I really think that is an issue that you're missing.
I mean, on that, I haven't said that we're well funded. I mean, I think I need to make that clear. I haven't said that we're well funded or we've had increases in funding. My point was a wider point about settlement across other governmental departments. Education is doing better than other governmental departments. That's the point that I'm making. And like you, I've had to set my budget and I've had to make cuts. It's really painful and it's really difficult. And I totally empathise with you, but that is my job. And I think we've all been feeling that pain, and it is really difficult. I don't underestimate it, and I'm definitely not living in cloud cuckoo land on that.
I think we're going to have to wrap up now because of the next session's coming in. But thank you to all the panellists for an excellent debate. I think they hugely appreciated your. Thank you.